Okay.
Good evening. It is 5 p.m. I am Rob Watton, Chair of the Public Safety Committee, and I call this meeting to order. And Clerk Dean, please note the attendance, including Councilmember Cotton and Councilmember Christensen, as well as our guest council member, Ethan Benson. Good evening. With that, we will move on to the approval of the agenda. Council members?
So moved. Second.
Moved by Council Member Cotton, seconded by Council Member Christensen. Are there any changes to tonight's agenda? I do have one request, and we will recognize City Administrator Mike Chambliss for comments prior to public comments. Are there any other changes? Hearing none, we will accept the agenda as approved. Thank you very much. Moving on, I will call on our City Administrator.
As I'm sure the committee's aware, there was a fire this weekend downtown. As you can see, our chief is returned for vacation tomorrow. So I will make sure that a full report's prepared for your next meeting.
Okay, thank you. It was certainly a devastating piece of information to receive yesterday morning when I woke up. I am so grateful for our police department, and it helps to underscore the fact of having 24/7 with 3 officers always on, the benefit it has for our entire community. We could have lost much more than the 3 businesses. And so kudos to having an outstanding police department and a fire department that responded quickly, and the mutual aid that came from the neighboring communities as well. It just kind of underscores the importance of what we have locally, and having our own independence in being able to have that kind of response in the time of need, and partners outside of our community that also lend a hand in that. So we wish a quick recovery to those 3 businesses that are so critical to the downtown. So thank you very much. Moving on, I will in a moment open the floor for public comment. It is limited now to those here in the room. If you happen to be online, you are always welcome to send the city clerk or to the council your concerns. We always want to hear from our residents and the people that the policies that we consider and the decisions we make are inclusive of everyone in the community. In opening the floor to the public comments, we're going to allow 3 minutes per comments. Please keep your comments, 1, generic to our meeting. Please do not identify individuals, as we will make sure that your comments will be heard. Please be respectful. Please keep to the topics concerning public safety, particularly the work and the items that are here in front of us tonight. When you are recognized, we're going to ask for your legal name and address for the record. And as I mentioned, direct your comments to the committee as a whole and not as individuals, including the staff or anyone else that is on the council or elected. Please understand that we will listen intently. At the discretion of the chair, we may refer your matters directly to the administration or department director for further follow-up. And again, keep your comments germane to public safety, health, and wellness topics. Would anybody at this time like to speak? Please come to the mic.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor Ross and council members. My name is Simone Grayling. I am a longtime resident of North Bend. As all of you guys are very much aware of the investigation going on, hi, it's me. I also want to ask if we could possibly have you guys update the police policy or Snoqualmie police policy on the website or make it more accessible for everyone to be able to read and know their rights. And I also want to ask you guys if we can please initiate a second investigation against another officer.
Okay,
I won't name names.
pardon me. As I mentioned, we need to keep the comments germane. If there's specific comments that especially of legal nature, please direct that to the mayor and to the city attorney for further follow-up.
Respectfully,
This forum is only for bringing concerns of traffic, safety, public safety, general topics. If it's more specific than that, then please send those to the administration so that they can be appropriately responded to. Those things are not addressed in this format. However, if you have general concerns that we need to know about, we're very much welcoming that.
okay, respectfully, thank you, sir. Yes, please, if you guys would not mind updating the website with the policy for the Snoqualmie PD, not just their misconduct in terms of violence or excessive force, but actually what you guys and the city of Snoqualmie is expecting of the police officers and how they conduct themselves. That would be greatly appreciated. And I think that would also alleviate the workload for the city clerk, which would be awesome. And then if I can also just ask that there is some response from the city administrators, because I have been emailing them, but have had no response. And that's all.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any further comments? Are there any further comments? The last call, and hearing none, I will close this portion of the public meeting. Public comments close at this time. Thank you very much. We appreciate your comments. Thank you. We'll move on to the next item of business, and that is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting, April 1st, 2024. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Been moved by Councilmember Christensen, seconded by Councilmember Cotton. Are there any corrections, additions to last meeting's minutes? Hearing none. With that, we will approve the minutes as presented. Next, I'm going to call on Police Chief Lynch to present on the ordinance relating to the misuse of emergency response system, AB 24-015. Chief Lynch, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor, council members. What we're going to talk about as soon as we get the PowerPoint up, this is something that I've been working on for the last few months, and I feel that it is important enough to bring to you and get your input on this. We have a real problem specifically in the city of Snoqualmie with the misuse of the 911 emergency response system. And I want to discuss a little bit about how the system works. And when we say the 911 response system, what that looks like. The city of Snoqualmie contracts with the Issaquah Police Department Dispatch Center. And we pay a monthly fee for that service. That system, or that 911 center, covers all of the police department dispatching for the city of Issaquah and for Snoqualmie and North Bend. They also are on communications on the radios with the Issaquah jail, who have several members that are on at a time downstairs below the station at the jail. So at any one time, like during the day, they could possibly have up to 15 police officers or staff that are logged into the system and that are needing airtime or the dispatcher's undivided attention when they can get it. That dispatch center normally has a minimum of 2 dispatchers. It's a small room. You could probably fit 8 or 9 of the dispatch center rooms into this room. Sometimes there are overlap for shifts where we have 3 dispatchers, and very rarely do we have 4. And we will have somebody working the radio, and then we'll have call receivers at that time. And so we're going to go over a little bit of the stats later on about how busy that 911 center is, the type of calls that they're taking. But in the meantime, we've identified a problem where we have citizens that are calling, and they're calling either 911 directly, or they're calling the 7-digit line, the non-emergency line, directly to the dispatch center, which goes to the same, most of the time, 2 dispatchers. They have to answer all the phones, the emergencies and the non-emergencies. Or they are calling in on the phone tree to the police department, and they're pushing the button that says to be transferred to the dispatch center, press this. So they're getting in 3 different ways to that 911 center. Now, the problem is the calls that we're getting are non-emergency. They are nothing to report that is new. They are harassing in nature. They take time away from the dispatchers who should be paying attention to the radio, answering emergency calls and non-emergency calls where there is a police response that is needed. So the numbers are going up on the amount of times that our dispatchers are having to answer the phones in these circumstances. You can go to the next slide. So the first 2 RCWs are generally what are used for calling 911 and doing a false report. But the person has to actually, to commit this crime, report something that they know is not an emergency and get an emergency response that puts people in danger, takes resources off of the road, either fire department or police department. So it doesn't really fit the calling the non-emergency line and harassing and talking about the police department in particular. Or we have telephone harassment. But the problem with the RCW at telephone harassment is that the person has to make these harassing, intimidating, tormenting, or embarrassing phone calls to the actual person that they are harassing. So the dispatchers don't fall under that category. So we find on most of the times when we bring an ordinance to you, a loophole in the state laws where it's falling through the cracks and we have no way of holding somebody accountable for their actions. Go to the next one. I know that it's kind of tough to see from so far away, but I do have the slides that I've given you so you can see those numbers, and we'll go over those. This is the final stats from the Issaquah Dispatch Center for 2023. And they had a total of 55,707 calls. That is 911, that is non-emergency, that is 7-digit lines, or being transferred from the phone tree at the police department. And then it's broken down into 911 calls, total 12,889 calls. And then you can see Issaquah outgoing calls where they're making phone calls in support of the Issaquah Police Department, 16,044 calls. And their incoming calls for Issaquah, 19,214. And the next 2 lines are going to be the city of Snoqualmie. So all of the numbers that you see at the bottom, that 6,996, those are non-911 calls. The person has actually dialed a 7-digit line and is either going directly to the Issaquah Dispatch Center, or they're calling the police department and going through the phone tree to be sent down to the dispatch center. So,
So Chief, pardon me.
sure.
So what you're suggesting is Issaquah's calls to the Issaquah call center
Mhm.
is almost in parity of incoming with outgoing. There's
Yeah.
almost,
That shows that the level of busyness from that room.
so it's like 90%, almost 90%, 80% of the outgoing calls are based on it. This case with us, it's the delta is so much greater
Yes.
of these incoming calls.
Yes.
To the center.
Yep.
Thank you.
We can go to the next slide. So the average 911 response time, and that is somebody actually picking up the phone when 911 is called. Their goals are to hit 90% of all 911 calls that are arriving to what's called a PSAP, the Public Safety Answering Points, a 911 center, shall be picked up within 10 seconds. And you can see on the top graph, there was a total of 12,469 911 calls that were under 10 seconds and 418 that were over. And those are going to be incidents where multiple phone calls are coming in, and are emergency, and they cannot get off the phone, or they're stacking up phone calls in the queue. But they did a good job because it comes out to 3%. Now their goal is to have 90% answered. Well, they only missed 3% of their 911 calls that came in that were greater than 10 seconds. And on the lower graph, you can see the less than 20 seconds goes to 12,866, but 21 of those calls in 2023 went over 20 seconds, which comes out to 0.1% of all the calls, 911 calls that came in. So they're meeting their 95% of all calls should be answered within 20-second goal. That's the standard for 911 centers in this county and in this state. Next one. Now, the data that you'll see on the next couple of slides, we have chosen to focus on one prolific caller and give you just a sample of the amount of resources this one person is able to take. So in 2023, this one particular caller called the dispatch center 119 times. It should be noted that prior to the end of June of last year, a lot of these calls were not being entered as an actual incident. And I've given direction to the 911 center since the end of June to every time this person calls and it's not an emergency, they don't need a police response, they're actually making an incident and they're entitling it CIT for the crisis intervention team. And those calls have to be screened by an on-duty sergeant or supervisor to find out if there is a reason to make contact, or if it's the same routine where it's just, reliving things in the past, which the majority of these calls are. Then we close those calls out and we do not make contact with this particular person. So put it in comparison, most people don't call the 911 center 7-digit line very often in a year. This one particular person 119 times. If by chance someone called the non-emergency line 10 times, which in my opinion is pretty high, okay, that would only account for 0.14% of all of the 911 calls, or all of the phone calls that came in to that 911 center. But you can see the burden of that. The numbers are so large that it is taking dispatchers time to answer the phone calls when they're talking on the radio, when we have other phone calls that are coming in. Go to the next slide, please. So these numbers here are for the first 3 months of this year in 2024. And what I did was I broke down the incoming non-emergency calls to the Issaquah Police Dispatch Center, 6,996. We've already discussed that number. And I broke it down, that number divided by 12 comes out to 583 per month, or 19 per day. Okay. Using the figures above, it's estimated that dispatch receives 1,749 calls to the Snoqualmie non-emergency line during the first 3 months of 2024. So 1,749. During that time, this one specific person has called 149 times. So the numbers have gone up because we are tracking the numbers religiously now. And during that time, this one specific person, the 149 calls, accounts for 8.5% of all incoming non-emergency calls on the Snoqualmie line. Next slide. So emergency calls broken down, 911 calls. Okay, they received 12,889 911 calls last year. And this math is based on the assumption that we're going to be exactly the same as last year, which it hardly ever is. It goes up. But in addition to the burden that this particular caller places on the 911 center, they actually stepped up and dialed 911 itself 9 times in a 19-minute span in one evening in March. And those calls were routed from the King County Dispatch Center for King County Sheriff's Department, because they hit off a tower that had to be routed to Issaquah. So of those 9 calls, they are actually talking to 2 different dispatch centers and taking time to be transferred. And that span of 911 calls accounts for 25% of dispatch's average daily 911 call load that one day. So all of the 911 calls came in. This one person accounted for a quarter of them. Next slide. So what to do to change this cycle that we seem to be perpetually in? I'm proposing that we enact a new ordinance, a misuse of the 911 emergency response system. And the language in this ordinance that I've chosen to put in here are pieces that are taken from several different ordinances that have already been passed in the last few years by other counties, other cities, including Okanagan County, Spokane County, Walla Walla County, Chelan County, Edmonds PD, amongst other smaller departments that have done the same thing. So it would actually make it a misdemeanor for a person to misuse the 911 emergency system when they make repeated non-emergency calls, irrespective of the duration of time between the calls, to the Issaquah Police Communications Center to report a situation that the person reasonably believes requires prompt service in order to preserve human life. This is any other reason other than to report a situation where that person believes they need to have prompt service, or to report new information in an active investigation. Those calls are okay. We want to hear from them about those. We want the people to call and report those things. The repeated calls include, but are not limited to, the repeated reporting of incidents without providing new information. That's what we're seeing. There is absolutely nothing new in these 149 calls that this person has made. Repeated requests to speak to specific officers. They are circumventing the system by calling the city phone tree, the police department's phone tree, and getting sent down to the dispatch center. When they have options to stay on the line, if no one answers, they can leave a message. They can send emails, which this person does prolifically. There's no need to continue to call the Issaquah Dispatch Center. or the harassment of specific officers using rude, lewd, or threatening language. That happens daily on these calls. I actually have staff that pulls those 911 recordings or those non-emergency recordings, and we have them saved, and I listen to them. Every day that she calls, I see that there's been CIT calls from this one particular citizen. I review them, and there is absolutely nothing new in those calls. It would also be a misdemeanor to make an emergency call or calls to the Issaquah 911 center for a purpose other than to report a situation that the person reasonably believes requires prompt service in order to preserve human life or property, or if they allow another person to use communication equipment owned, rented, or leased by or under the control of the person to make such calls to the 911 center. And being that it would be a misdemeanor under this ordinance, it comes with a $1,000 fine set by the court and or 90 days in jail. Now, we did some research and found that under state law, we have the ability to ask for restitution on certain calls. And other agencies have done this and written this into their ordinances, where in addition to any criminal penalty, the city may impose a fine or administrative sanction up to $500 per incident to reimburse the 911 emergency response agency for costs incurred as a result of the misuse of the 911 emergency system. The next slide, please. We touched on this earlier. At any one time, one more slide. There we go. At any one time, we have a minimum of 2 call receivers / dispatchers. And they're covering 2 police departments in 3 cities, nearly 61,000 citizens. They're waiting for 911 calls and non-emergency calls to come in. And a delay in the dispatch answering an emergency call because they're handling a repeat offender, as described above, it puts citizens at risk. It puts police officers at risk, because the only thing that a police officer has at their disposal to get help to them or to somebody else or to report something that is actually going on is that radio. And we have to have somebody on the other end of that line that answers us every time that we call for help, or that we say we're on a traffic stop, or we're getting out of the car to contact somebody. So the actions of people that would violate this are a direct risk to the 61,000 citizens in 3 different cities. So that comes to the end of my slideshow. I think there's just one more questions. Like I said, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel or write things in that are untested by other counties. This language all came from a mixture of several different agencies that have passed this in the last few years. So I'd entertain any questions that you have about this right now.
Thank you, Chief Lynch. Thank you for your work on this too. And obviously you've done a lot of research, and it's, to me, it's a little disturbing how far this abuse has gone, and clear in my mind as to we need to do something about it. Councilmember Cotton.
In your presentation, and again, thank you very much for that, there was a mention of the fees like per incident. Now, this is just to reimburse for the dispatch side of things. What are the numbers or the stats for our police department personnel having to go through your time in listening to all these calls and all the documentation that's going into this? Is there additional items that can be put in regarding, that type of imposition of a penalty as well?
Yeah, so the first time that I wrote this and I sent it to the city legal department for review, it got sent back with some questions about that particular section. And state law says that we as a police department can hold somebody criminally liable for a violation that's on the books, and we can ask for restitution to go to the victims. In this, we were not able, I had it written the first time that the money would go to us, to go to the city as a like administrative fine. We can't do that. So it would have to go to the dispatch center because they're the ones that are shouldering the burden of this. And they're the ones that are having to take these multiple calls per day. And so I tried, but there's a legal precedent saying that we can't.
Okay.
And I don't know how to quantify the time that we put in on this one particular citizen. It's immense. You know,
Yeah.
it's every day.
Yeah.
Councilmember Christensen, do you have any questions or comments?
I had a whole series of questions and I
Excellent.
appreciated my chat with Captain today to get those answered as well as the fact that many of the questions that I answered were in the presentation as well. So thank you for that. At the outset, I was trying to determine basically what the impact was, how many calls we were getting, how much of an impact it was going to have there, as well as what other jurisdictions did and if they've implemented similar legislation. I'd also asked about how many calls were made to 911 and just trying to gauge how many harassing phone calls there were. Obviously, to the extent that we go forward with legislation like this, then, you know, there's always going to be the concern that there's going to be a chilling effect and somebody, you know, may decide not to call 911 because they don't want to get penalized. But I think that the way that it's being handled and directed, I think it's very clear that we're aiming it at people who are demonstrably harassing dispatch and our police. And so my normal concerns, I think there are definitely outweighed by the harm that's currently happening. And I know how much time our chief is spending and how much time staff is spending on this particular situation. And while it's unfortunate that we would need to move forward in this fashion, I do think that it's unfortunately necessary.
Any further comments from administration? Mayor?
I think, can you, I guess, review number 3 again? So allows another person to use communications equipment owned, rented or leased by.
Allows another person to use communication equipment owned, rented, or leased by, or under the control of the person to make an emergency or non-emergency call or calls to the Issaquah Police Department or the Issaquah Communication 911 Center for a purpose other than to report a situation that the other person reasonably believes requires prompt service to, in order to preserve human life or property.
So this would be the person that calls quite a bit now loaning her phone to somebody else to call.
Yes. And when they call 911, we track the phone, we track the location. That all comes in on the 911 system. It's not as easy when they are dialing the 7-digit line, but we can investigate those as they come.
Okay. Are you getting any of those calls at this point? Or you just anticipate that that will happen?
No, I don't believe we have.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Cotton.
Is
please.
the next step then to bring this before the full council?
I believe that's your recommendation.
Yes.
So the question is, this needs 2 readings. Unless there is a need to waive the first reading. And that would be at the discretion of FNA, at the direction of perhaps this committee. Councilmember Christensen.
I will typically not support anything on a first read, especially if it's in this type of a situation as well.
Of not waiving the first read.
Yes, correct. Sorry.
Okay. Does that seem reasonable? Did we go through 2 readings? And the next question to the committee is this. Should we do the first reading as a full presentation and the second potentially as a consent item. And we can make that determination between the council meeting and the second reading. Is that a reasonable approach? If we reserve, we can review this at our next committee meeting before presenting it for the second reading, which could be at the discretion of this committee's recommendation to the FNA of being on consent. And that gives us a chance at our next committee meeting of gauging the input from the first reading. Councilmember Christensen.
Can we put it on consent for the second reading? I thought it was typically structured differently on the agenda.
I don't believe we can put it on consent.
I think it would just
Maybe-
go the first read and then the second read, and then there would be a motion on it.
Okay,
But that could be at the second, pardon me, at the second meeting.
And
no, please.
I would recommend the full presentation. I think it's something that the public would need to hear and that the entire council would need to hear, because when you break down the facts, I think it does a good job of explaining why this is absolutely.
So there's more transparency in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Councilmember Cotton.
Chief, can you keep us informed if there's any escalation of whether the frequency of the calls at the presentation, or God forbid, any escalation in harm or singling out a particular individual? If, I think that would be
definitely can do that.
critical.
I definitely can do that.
Any other further comments? Let's see, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor of sending this to first reading through the FNA and putting it on the agenda, signify by saying aye.
I twice.
Okay. So carries. Thank you very much.
Very much.
All right, who is running this slideshow? Or who's running me? That's the next question. Is
Jimmy
it
must-
Jimmy?
He was doing the slideshow. I've been putting the agenda up.
Got it. Okay. What I'd like to do, Jimmy, is to share my screen on our priorities.
Go ahead.
If I may, sir? Okay, thank you. Let me go over to. And I do want to premise this on a couple things. One is that I've got this spreadsheet, this massive spreadsheet that we talked about at our council retreat. If you happen to be following along at home, it's large. And it was brought up that our 2023 council retreat, we came up with some priorities. And Mayor Pro Tem Holloway brought up one of these items for discussion, and I thought, well, it'd be appropriate to add it to our list of priorities. The alternative fire department service delivery models, and I realize that Chief Bailey's not with us tonight, so I will do my best channeling of him. But in the notes, it says direction is needed from the city council regarding next steps. So I think before we get there, it has to come through public safety. Mr. Chambliss.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Chief Bailey about that. And he understands the errors, his ways, direction has been provided. So he is preparing information to come to this committee
Okay.
prior to going to council.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The second one is on the top of the list from 2023, and this is something that Councilmember Cotton reminded us a couple months ago, and that is the evaluation of fee for transport program, fee for service for transport program. So I added that to this list. And what we're trying to do is just basically uplift anything that was brought up previously in our committee this year, but also give respect to what the work we've done already in the past 2 years. The third one that I added and elevated from 2 to 1 on this list is a little bit farther down here, and that's street safety. It's been brought up a couple times by citizens in our meetings, and I want to be respectful of them, so that I elevated that. We had it down as a 2. I raised it to a 1, and I hope that you concur with bringing that up. Now, here's the big discussion for tonight, and that is, how do we move forward? Do we identify and focus? And the reality is we can really focus on 3 to 5 things any given time. And are there any things on this list that you think, well, there's a top 3 item, and there's a number of things. Overdoses and fentanyl was brought up by both council members Christensen and Cotton. Echo Glen has been on top of mine, and was also an item in the 2023 retreat. And the other things are more administrative. They're like department accreditation, strategic plan, and the comprehensive emergency medical, or no, emergency, what's management plan. And then tonight we saw that, you know, with the 911 abuse enforcement. So with that, do you have any input, council members Christensen and Cotton, things that stand out that either are on this list or should be on this list as a top item?
So are we trying to condense the number of 1s down to, like you said, like potentially 3 to 7, or 3 to 5?
3 to 5, I would say.
Span of control.
Right. Yeah. What are your thoughts? Yes.
Do you mind if I share my screen?
Please.
I'm gonna throw the work plan that we came up
Okay.
with up there. As soon as I find Zoom.
So we've got about 12 items on the work plan.
Pretty big items.
They are.
And 75% of the leadership positions are filled currently in public safety.
Mhm. Mhm. But I guess it comes back to policy. What is it that we can, there's day-to-day stuff, and that's not the role of the public safety. It's what do we need to elevate from a public policy standpoint that stands out from these items then? Yes, Councilmember Cotton.
Well, things like the, kind of the accreditation and strategic plan, those types of items are more internally within the department. And those aren't things we necessarily have control over. So maybe while they're certainly important to the overall status of both fire and police going through those processes, I think it's definitely something that the Public Safety Committee or the council as a whole is not going to necessarily affect that on a day-to-day basis.
So we're not going to have as much influence on these as the professional management of
The teams that know what they're
departments.
working on over in both departments, and of course, the police department's getting their LEMAP evaluation soon, which will help lead them with that. But that's not something we necessarily have control over. I think the items that we can affect directly can be things like budget
Mhm.
and contract negotiation.
Budget priorities, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Councilmember Christensen, I'm curious about your thoughts.
I'd agree with that as well. I do want to make sure they're being sensitive to staff time, because I think that they'll have their hands full with a number of things coming up. One other point of caution that I'd put out too is just with respect to Echo Glen, while it remains obviously something that's very important that we keep an eye on and things like that, we do also have to be kind of sensitive as to the content of those conversations to make sure anything that should not be publicly disseminated
Right,
is.
right.
So that would be one of the other concerns that I'd have just as we go forward, since that is a ranking for number one.
It's more the overarching public safety. Would that be a better way of saying it?
Probably.
Yeah. Okay, very good. For the sake of time tonight, and I'll get with you just in a moment. For the sake of time tonight, I'm going to add a column, and that's something to the effect of public safety committee request sort of thing, because there's public safety and then there's administration and there's always budget considerations there. And it comes back to Councilmember Cotton's comments that, you know, we need to focus on what we, as far as policy setters, have control over and direction, and give the resources to the department to implement as they have the bandwidth to do so. Mr. Chambliss.
Just gonna let you know, if you want to read ahead in the agendas, the budget calendar is being introduced tomorrow night at FNA. And I think it was something like 29 meetings between now and the end of the year, between committees and council meetings
Yay.
and special meetings. So there is a large work coming to all levels of government here shortly.
Well, we're excited. I can tell you about that. And see pizza in our future. Yes, Clerk D, please.
Councilmember Holloway is online and has a question.
Oh,
No, sorry, raised hand inadvertently.
oh, well, it's nice to see your hand virtually. All right.
Yeah.
With that, is there anything else to come before us, council members, for future agendas or administration? And we will continue our work on the priorities as we go forward, and appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. It's always a joy to have people in the audience in person. So thank you very much. With that, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded by Councilmember Cotton, followed by Councilmember Christensen. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And we are adjourned.